little while longer. So we're delighted to have a wonderful program of readers and speakers to celebrate Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Let me just make two really quick announcements of some upcoming events, so I hope you'll join us again. These are in-person events. For poets, you'll be interested to know that on May 4th, a Wednesday, at 6 p.m., we have Andrea Carter-Brown and Elaine Sexton will be here. Andrea's from New York as well as California. Anyway, she'll be visiting, and we're looking forward to having that event May 4th. We're doing several events celebrating John Steinbeck this season, and we want you to know about an important date, May 19. We have a very esteemed literary critic, Bob Coors, and Don Coors. Don Coors speaking on The Moon is Down, which is, some considered a controversial novel of Steinbeck's. It's a war novel, it's a resistance novel. It has great relevance today. It's was very important during World War II and the resistance movement in Europe. So that's May 19 on The Moon is Down. This is going to be at the Rotunda at the John Germain Library. So as you know, all our information is online at our website, so please, look for that. So I have to thank Charles Magistro, if anyone knows him. I'm sorry he's not joining us tonight, but this event was his idea. So, I am grateful for that. And of course, we want to celebrate the great poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who left us almost a year ago at a very advanced age of cent'anni plus, one or two, I don't remember. So,
almost two.
So we have, as you see on your program, we have some wonderful friends and experts and poets to present different aspects of Ferlinghetti. I'm just going to mention our speakers and get out of the way and turn it over to each of you, and I'll just remind you to please say your name when you come up to the podium here. So, introductory remarks beginning with Fred Gardaphe, who's been at Canio's many times for many events. Fred is Distinguished Professor of English and Italian American Studies at Queens College, CUNY, and the Calandra Italian American Institute. He's a Fulbright Fellow and past President of the Italian American Studies Association and the Working Class Studies Association. He has several books published, including Italian Signs, American Streets, From Wise Guys to Wise Men, The Art of Reading Italian Americana, and Read 'em and Reap. He's co-founding co-editor of VIA, that's Voices in Italian Americana, and editor of the Italian American Culture series of SUNY Press, and associate editor of Fra Noi. And working on new things to come, we look forward to those publications. Joining us from further west is George Wallace, poet and writer-in-residence at the Walt Whitman Birthplace. George is author of over 38 chapbooks. We have several here on the tables. He's associate professor of English, adjunct at Pace University. And there's a new anthology, a wonderful new anthology George put together, a labor of love to be sure. This book is called New York City from the Inside, New York City Through the Eyes of the Poets Who Live Here. We have copies of that available. Joining us is Mary Mart, the legendary bookseller, along with husband Michael Mart at the wonderful, esteemed Good Times Bookshop in Port Jefferson. Mary will be sharing remembrances of Ferlinghetti and City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco. We have several poets in the community, good friends all, and wonderfully accomplished writers. Bart Mallio, poet, musician, and author of a forthcoming collection, Out on the Rim of Now. Heidi Rain, writer, artist, and community activist. And Tom Oleszczuk, poet and community activist. All of you are very important to Canio's, and we appreciate your participation. as we celebrate Lawrence Ferlinghetti. So let's have a warm-up applause for our first speaker, Fred Gardaphe.
Thank you, Mary Ann and Catherine. It's always a pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to give just a little bit of background on Lawrence Ferlinghetti for those who might not be quite familiar with him. And then I'll have a few of my stories with him, and it'll all happen within 15 minutes, so don't worry. And then I'm going to read one of his poems. I was hitchhiking to San Francisco, actually around the United States in 1973, just a 20-year-old kid out there on the road. And when I got to San Francisco, one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to meet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I wanted to go to City Lights Books and meet Lawrence Ferlinghetti because I was in the hospital about 6 months before that for a work-related injury, and I got a Coney Island of the mind, and it just threw me off. I fashioned myself a young wannabe poet. Trying to get to the point where Keats was when he died. I never even got there in the last 60 years. But so what happened was I found Ferlinghetti in the bookstore, and I just bought all his books, and I said, I got to meet this guy. I hitchhike all the way to San Francisco, and I go into City Lights Books, and I asked the clerk there, is Mr. Ferlinghetti? Oh yeah, he's in his office downstairs. So I go downstairs, and his office door is cracked. His feet are up, and I hear him snoring. And I said, oh, I can't bother him at all, So I went upstairs and I bought a book, a whole other story, David Curtian's 6 San Francisco Poets, and I left, and I didn't go back. Fast forward 10 years, there's a book out in the window, Barry Selesky's biography of Ferlinghetti. I'm a wannabe book reviewer at that point, and I get a chance to interview Ferlinghetti when that book comes out. And I go in there, and I meet him, and I'm nervous as hell, but I'm a little older now. And so, he starts interviewing me, which is one of the great things about Lawrence, is he doesn't care to talk about himself as much as he wants to know who he's talking to, who is he giving this information to. And so he said, what do you do, so on and so forth. And so I said, well, one time I almost met you. He says, why didn't you, knock on my door? I said, you were sleeping. He goes, damned all that. He says, you went all the way over there and you didn't even come and knock on my door and see me. And so this, some of what I'm going to read a little bit, then I'm going to read the poetry. Some of it comes from the interview I did with him and the book review. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was a poet, editor, playwright, artist, novelist, truth seeker, truth sayer. What he contributed to the American conscience is a depth, a concentration, and a simplicity that few of today's writers can match. He has published and defended controversial literature in courts, has traveled to enemy countries, enemy in quotation marks, and has shared those experiences through his writing. Now, he didn't always talk about his being a young kid, but I pushed him away, and he gave me this information. He grew up as Lawrence Ferling. His birth certificate. In fact, when he went to the Navy, it was the first time he found out that his name was actually Ferlinghetti. This was a decision made by his older brothers, and this is a quote from him. They shortened the name because Italian at that time was like the Dago gardener, who was the lowest thing on the scale, smelling of garlic and pepperoni. I want you to remember that phrase because it's going to come back. My brothers tried to get away from that as soon as possible, especially in the rich suburbs of New York. They shortened the name and never told me. Years later, I was applying to get into the Navy and wrote for my birth certificate and came back with Ferlinghetti. That was the first I'd heard of it. It took me a few years to get around to restoring it. It seemed the thing to do. Ferling sounded Scandinavian or something. During the 50s and 60s, we were all getting back to our roots. Born in 1919, he was the youngest of 5 boys. His parents met in a Coney Island boarding house, and later his father had a real estate office on 42nd Street. The family was completely broke when the father died. At that time, they were living up in Ossining, where Sing Sing is. He writes, he says, "My brothers were in their early teens when my father died. None of them got any education. One lied about his age and got a job at the prison. He became an assistant warden. I wrote to him after I restored the name to Ferlinghetti. He was furious and told me, 'I'm too old to start explaining this to my secretary.' For all those years he had passed as Anglo-Saxon. My father came from Brescia in 1900, probably on the same boat with the Godfather. He came through Ellis Island and settled in Little Italy. He was an auctioneer. That's about all I know about him. He died before I was born, so I missed that Italian influence. His mother was born in New York. She was of Spanish, Portuguese, Sephardic Jew. Her family migrated from Portugal during the Spanish Inquisition to Nice in France. Some of them moved to the Virgin Islands on a Danish crown colony expedition. From there they came to the United States. As a young boy, he was taken to France shortly after his father's death and lived there until the age of 7. His first language was French, he says. By the time World War II started, he had earned his BA in literature from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and enlisted in the Navy as an ensign. Later, he was promoted to lieutenant. After the war, he completed his MA in literature at Columbia University, and this is where he ran into the likes of Ginsberg and Kerouac. And later, he went off to do his PhD in the Sorbonne, and he did this all on the GI Bill. He knew how to use that. He earned his doctorate from the Sorbonne, and when he returned to the United States, took up residence in San Francisco and opened City Lights, the nation's first all-paperback bookstore. Book sales soon led to book publishing as he began City Lights Press. One of his earliest publications was Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems, now a classic, then the subject of an obscenity trial that launched Ferlinghetti's career as a public spokesperson for truth and a defender of our freedom of speech. This is during the post-war era that we have come to know as the days of the Beats. And here's what he has to say about his Italian heritage. He said, "I find the hereditary bloodline has a lot to do with people's natural capabilities. Lorenzo, who was his son, was always a poor student. He doesn't read or write much in English, but he went to Mexico a few summers ago and met a girl who didn't speak any English. And ever since, he's been corresponding with her and taking Spanish. And he took to it. It's something in his blood. His teacher says he even sounds Spanish, and he's never been to Spain." Now, I would say the key to Ferlinghetti's success is his ability to connect words to actions, to put his body where his words ask us to go. He has continually denounced government support of the arts, and has never taken a penny from such sources as NEA. He was involved in anti-war protests and community organizations throughout his lifetime. He spearheaded a movement to rename San Francisco streets after city writers, which has been somewhat successful. And later in life, he focused his greatest efforts on his painting, an art that has always been a part of his life. He says the same for his experience with Italian. He says, "I go back to Italy in a couple of weeks. If I'm traveling with Italians, I can speak quite fluently and read the papers. But when I come back here, it disappears. About a month, I can't even speak to my landlord in North Beach. My older brothers still spoke Italian if they wanted to, but they don't. Could still, but they don't. Before he died, he lived in North Beach, where he had City Lights Press and the bookstore, which is in the city's Italian district. But that little Italy is fast disappearing. And he said a little bit before he died, he said, now it's being bought up by the Chinese. I think there are less than 500 families left. Most of the Italians have moved to the suburbs. They've lost their sense of community. They're sitting out there in the suburbs and wish they headed back, but it's too late. Now they're trying to regroup. There used to be an Italian daily paper called Italia, but it's gone." Much of Ferlinghetti's poetry deals with political subjects. His voice can be heard wailing against injustice and for peace. A book list reviewer once referred to him as one of our ageless radicals and true bards. I'm going to read a poem called Italians Dying, and here's what he had to say about it. "I couldn't write that poem today. They're all gone. They're not sitting in the square anymore." Ferlinghetti is an accessible poet whose works often appear on the op-ed pages of major U.S. newspapers. He referred to his accessibility as public surface. He says, not much poetry today has visual excitement. People are writing poems about walking down the street, but what they are seeing is not what's there on the page. Old Italians Dying is an objective description of sitting in the square, a sticking to what's going down right in front of me. But you can never make it completely objective. I see the coffin as a black boat without sails. The person in the coffin is like a fisherman on his last trip to the sea. And I'm going to read the poem now. The Old Italians Dying by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. For years, the old Italians have been dying all over America. For years, the old Italians in faded felt hats have been sunning themselves and dying. You have seen them on the benches in the park in Washington Square. The old Italians in their high black button shoes. The old men in their old felt fedoras with stained hatbands have been dying and dying day by day. You have seen them every day in Washington Square, San Francisco. The slow bell tolls in the morning in the church of Peter and Paul. In the marzipan church on the plaza, towards 10 in the morning, the slow bell tolls in the towers of Peter and Paul. And the old men who are still alive sit sunning themselves in a row on the wood benches in the park and watch the processions in and out. Funerals in the mornings, weddings in the afternoon, slow bell in the morning, fast bell at noon. In one door, out the other, the old men sit there in their hats and watch the coming and going. You have seen them, the ones who feed the pigeons, cutting the stale bread with their thumb and penknives, the ones with old pocket watches, the old ones with gnarled hands and wild eyebrows, the ones with the baggy pants with both belt and suspenders, the grappa drinkers with teeth like corn, the Piemontese, the Genovese, the Siciliani, smelling of garlic and pepperoni, the ones who loved Mussolini, the old fascist, the ones who loved Garibaldi, the old anarchists reading L'Umanità Nova, the ones who love Sacco and Vanzetti. They are almost all gone now. They are sitting and waiting their turn and sunning themselves in front of the church, over the doors of which is inscribed a phrase which would seem to be unfinished from Dante's Paradiso, about the glory of the one who moves everything. The old men are waiting for it to be finished, for their glorious sentence on earth to be finished. The slow bell tolls and tolls. The pigeons strut about, not even thinking of flying. The air too heavy with heavy tolling. The black hired hearses draw up. The black limousines with black window shades shielding the windows. The widows with the black long veils who will outlive them all. You have seen them, Madre di Terra, Madre di Mare. The widows climb out of the limousines. The family mourners step out in stiff suits. The widows walk so slowly up the steps of the cathedral, fishnet veils drawn down, leaning hard on dark cloth arms. Their faces do not fall apart. They are merely drawn apart. They are still the matriarchs, outliving everyone, in little Italies all over America. The old dead Daigles hauled out in the morning sun that does not mourn for anyone. One by one, year by year, they are carried out. The bell never stops tolling. The old Italians with lap-straight faces are hauled out of their hearses by the paid pallbearer in mafioso morning coats and dark glasses. The old men are hauled out in their black coffins like small skiffs. They enter the true church for the first time in many years in these carved black boats. The priests scurry about as if to cast off the lines. The other old men still alive on the benches watch it all with their hats on. You have seen them sitting there, waiting for the bocce ball to start rolling, for the bell, waiting for the bell, for the slow bell to be finished tolling, telling the unfinished Paradiso story, as seen in an unfinished phrase on the face of a church, in a black boat without sails, making his final haul.
Well, that would be impossible. Let's get to the real glasses. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Canios, for 42 years as a lightning rod for literature in Sag Harbor and across the region. Not that literature wasn't here, but the work of Canio for many years from the day he opened this place, after being stuck out here with a hurricane, to the day that you guys took it over, and right up to the present. Canio's has been a remarkable force as a Long Islander. We returned to Long Island in 1988, 8 years after the place was open. And knowing Canio from Harborfields, who was teaching Italian and Spanish, I came out here. And of course, there's a Friday night thing, a Saturday night thing. It was one of the only locations on Long Island where poetry was happening to any significant extent for many years. There was a Long Island Poetry Collective in Huntington. Stony Brook did a little bit. Hofstra did a little bit. But this was it. This was it. And it was Canio's remarkable charm and ability to bring people together that brought the luminaries that were out here, you know, in Sag Harbor and in the Hamptons to this location, and the regional poets onto the same field. And it was something I learned way back then from Canio about, you know, crossing threads to see what emerges from it. I've carried with me my whole life as an organizer in poetry, so kudos to this outfit. I have just a few words to say, and then I'm going to read about 12 minutes worth of Lawrence Ferlinghetti poems. But you know, as a bipolar, as a polarity of these two Italian-American communities in New York City, Little Italy and Bleecker Street, on the one hand, and North Beach, you know, the relationship between Bohemian American culture and these Italian neighborhoods is something really important. And I'd love to hear from Fred about that someday. And at the same time, the fact that many of the Bohemians, going all the way back to George Sterling, who was from Sag Harbor, and went out and became part of the Bohemian Club. He co-founded the Bohemian Club with Jack London and some others. It goes back that far. And it continued right through the 50s, a couple of generations of it. So that Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Jack Hirschman and Harold Norse and Neely Tchaikovsky for that matter, and Diane DePrima for that matter, all of them New York people who went across to San Francisco, and there was this thing going on. So many of the poems that you read about many of these people have a sort of nostalgia for their childhood experiences in the New York area, growing up where they grew up, Coney Island of the Mind. You know, Penny Candy's Store Beyond the Hill was where I first fell in love with unreality. You know, a person in San Francisco from San Francisco couldn't write that. A person from New York City, even though he spent some of his time, Lawrence Ferlinghetti spent some of his time in Bronxville in a mansion, the Sarah Lawrence family's mansion. He also spent time in very rough neighborhoods and orphanages and boarding houses, so he knew this area. The fact that when we put together this collection, which Mary Ann mentioned before, New York City from the Inside, we were able to get work from Diane DePrima and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Jack Hirschman for a nostalgia for their childhood experiences. That informs both the San Francisco Renaissance and reinforms what we do here in New York. So I can tell you about going to Big Sur and visiting that cabin. It belonged to Larry Mendez Monsanto Ferlinghetti. Jack Kerouac had his nervous breakdown in, but I'd rather just read to you a couple of poems from the early days, because we have some people, especially the one that Fred read, a fabulous poem, and some other people who are going to read some of the more recent poems. It has some very quick ones, and they represent the prosody and the deconstructionist Dada experience that he was trying to, and the idea of absurdity, constantly risking absurdity and death. You know, the acrobat climbs on a high wire to his own making. And these are things that Ferlinghetti was seeking out at that time, as was Gregory Corso and some others. So that surrealist pop and excitement, and then also the comic energy. The absurdist comic energy is something that carries through. Plus also a tenderness and a kind of nostalgia. See, it was like this when we stepped into this place. A couple of papish cats was doing the Aztec two-step. So I says, Dad, let's cut. But then this dame comes up behind me, sees and says, you and me could really exist. Wow, I says. Only the next day, she has bad teeth and really hates poetry. I put out the word on Facebook to people, give me a request for what to read. And so Joe Allegretti from New Jersey, a poet in New Jersey, who walked across the George Washington Bridge to attend events in New York City, asked me to read this one. For all I know, maybe she was happier than anyone. That lone crone in the shawl on the orange crate train with the little tame bird in her handkerchief, crooning to it all the time, Mia Moscata, and none of the Sunday excursionists with their bottles and their baskets paying any attention, and the coach creaking on through cornfields so slowly that butterflies flew in and out. Here's that pop prosody. And this is definitely a San Francisco poem. The dog. The dog trots freely in the street and sees reality. And the things he sees are bigger than himself, and the things he sees are his reality. Drunks in doorways, moons on trees. The dog trots freely through the street, and the things he sees are smaller than himself. Fish on newsprint, ants in holes, chickens in Chinatown windows, their heads a block away. The dog trots freely in the street, and the things he smells something like himself. The dog trots freely in the street, past puddles and babies, past cats and cigars, pool rooms, policemen. He doesn't hate cops. He merely has no use for them. And past the dead cows hung up whole in front of the San Francisco meat market. He would rather eat a tender cow than a tough policeman, though either might do. And he goes past the Romeo Ravioli factory, and past Coit's Tower, and past Congressman Doyle. He's afraid of Coit's Tower, but he's not afraid of Congressman Doyle. Although what he hears is very discouraging, very depressing, very absurd to a sad young dog like himself, to a serious dog like himself. But he has his own free world to live in, his own fleas to eat. He will not be muzzled. Congressman Doyle is just another fire hydrant to him. The dog trots freely in the street and has his own dog's life to live and to think about and to reflect upon. Touching, tasting, testing everything, investigating everything without benefit of perjury. A real realist with a real tale to tell, and a real tale to tell it with. A real live barking democratic dog engaged in real free enterprise with something to say about ontology, something to say about reality, and how to see it and how to hear it, with his head cocked sideways at street corners as if he is just about to have his picture taken for Victor Records. Listening for his master's voice and looking like a live question mark into the great gramophone of puzzling existence with its wondrous hollow horn, which always seems just about to spout forth some